Shut up and sit down.
Hey everyone, welcome to what I believe is episode 147 of the Fitness Devil podcast. We don't always know the episodes off the top of our heads. And this one is special. I've said this a few times, something similar, that we've had people that I've long admired, respected, that I consider to be an aspirational guest. Martin Rooney, we had on recently, sort of fits that bill. But today we have the person I think is probably the most influential person in our industry that we've yet had to date on our podcast. And that's Dr. John Berardi. He's the founder of Precision Nutrition, and I'm really hopeful that you guys have all heard of him. So it's a real treasure to have you on here, John. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words. Thanks for everyone tuning in. If you haven't heard of me, you have now. So it's great. It's been remedied. And yeah, I've been looking forward to our conversation and sharing some nuggets and having just a good chat about all things industry and, what we're achieving and what we hope to achieve.
Well, and it was really hard to get you. We had to basically there was this whole filter system. We had to work our way through PM people, and then they'd be like, "Hey, these guys are all right." And there was it felt like a test. You know what I mean?
John's the final boss. John is the final boss. Right? We got through Craig Weller. We got through Adam Fight. We got through Brian St. Pierre. We got through Scott Dixon, who is wonderful. They're all wonderful people. So
yes. And, for those listening, and that's not because I think I'm so special or whatever, but it's because I'm kind of retired now. And so the amount of minutes I spent in work per week are very low. So it's just, hey, if I'm going to do one podcast a week, for example, they have to be ones that the hosts are great and we share similar philosophies and it's going to be a good conversation. And they've treated other members of the team really well. So you guys cleared all those bars. And so here we are today having a great conversation.
Well, this all started because you mentioned Jason Crow, who deserves a real shout out because he's, a major part of your guys' organization. And I've told this story on air before. He reached out to me, going, "Hey, I'm Jason from PN. We're the biggest, nutrition coaching company in the world, and we're the biggest certification coaching company in the world. And, maybe you've heard of us." And I'm like, "Yeah, dude." I respond to him. I have PN. I love your guys' work. And so he wanted us to feature, the aforementioned guests who all turned out to be super. And I had a few, very specific stories of things that I liked that I followed from you, and that turned into where we are right now. So
yeah, good lesson in that, by the way, too. Jason's approach there, really, rather than kicking down the door and being like, "Don't you know who I am?" It was a lead with humility, which I think is a good principle that sort of weaves through all the things we've done at Precision Nutrition and for coaches and anyone who works in the industry. Is really is a great lesson in maybe how to lead and foster new relationships.
Well, that's a good point. Well, that's a good point too. I was going to say it could go the other way, and not that we were expecting it to be any worse, but like you said, we had previous people on for PN, and they just blew us away. And was it Adam Fiat? So we had him on, and then I had a bunch of people messaging me "How did you not know who that is?" I had Coach Cav, and these guys are the smartest people ever. And it was just kind of a testament to, not that you don't know that when you look at PN, you go on the site, you look at the blogs, but it really didn't click until we started talking to everyone. I was like, okay, this is why they're successful. You know what I mean? You don't know that all the time unless you talk to the individuals, because it doesn't really show through.
And let's face it, you guys have your own lives and your own businesses to run and all this stuff. So you're not thinking about PN every minute of every day, right? And in situations like that, it's easy to oversimplify. I catch myself doing it all the time, right? So in this case, it would be like, oh, John Berardi's the figurehead or whatever, the front person or spokesperson for PN. So he's the one you want to talk to. And people oversimplify that all the time. I'm like, no, listen. You've got to have Brian for this piece of work, or Adam for this piece of work, or Krista for this piece of work, because they're better than me. And I'm not just saying that because I'd rather be playing with my kids, because they're doing that work every single day. It's just they're not in front of the camera all the time or the microphone. And again, another really important lesson, when we as, let's say, members of the health and fitness community look for advice, sometimes we look for the most publicized people. And there's often this army of better trained, more capable people that we've just simply never heard of through just whatever trickle down media attention. And so, I was asked recently, who are my mentors or people I look to for advice and stuff like that. And the answer was, you're going to be super disappointed. You've never heard of any of them, because I specifically seek out non-famous people to learn from. If I wanted to learn how to be famous and notable and get lots of attention and publicity, then those are the folks I would go to. But sometimes I'm looking for someone to help me with specific aspects of my life. And those are the people working away in the trenches I look for, not people who are notable or who, get on TV lots or whatever.
And we've had the same, let me do this one first. We've had that same conversation with Pete Dupuis, where Pete's talked about how people come in and these parents say, oh, I want my 12-year-old to work with Eric Cressy. And Pete's got to have that constant conversation. Well, actually, and Pete will be the first one to say, along with Eric, that as reputable and as brilliant as Eric is, Eric will himself say that there are coaches. Forgive me, there's noises in the background.
Baby pterodactyls.
Sounds
like baby pterodactyls.
Yeah, and Eric will say that some of the coaches at CSP are even better than Eric is. It's just that Eric's name is on the business. Pete laments that fact every day. I think he often talks about it. But you can develop some really big stars. It'd be like Mark Fisher Fitness and someone going in and going, well, I want to work with Mark. And yet he has Harold Gibbons there, and he has Raj Lawson there, and he has Brian Patrick Murphy, right? He has tons of really incredible people. And so,
and again, for entrepreneurs and aspiring business owners, there's lessons in here, really crucial lessons, right? Like having a person that people can hang the business mantle on, or the fame mantle on, or whatever, can be really beneficial if you use it for what it's good for, and then you build up a thing around them. I mean, PN has 150 team members now, right? So for anyone who thinks, oh, Precision Nutrition's John Berardi, I no longer even am involved operationally with the business, but even when I was, like, I did a couple of roles in a very complex organization with hundreds, if not thousands of roles to be done, so it's just really important, that if we are going to be aspirational in the entrepreneurship space or in the health and fitness space, we have to not just see the advantage that we have, but we have to say, can I peek under the hood? Can I really take a look at what's happening in these businesses, so I can understand how to model it or replicate it in some way? Because copying only what you see on the outside is always going to be a very, very poor indicator of what's really happening on the inside.
At what point did that vantage point change? Because I just at this point, fitness companies seem to be exploding, and they get to this level where like you said, they have this figurehead and they start to build some employees. But at what point did you realize I'm not the dude anymore, and I need to kind of build these people around me? Because that's a really hard thing to do, especially maybe for a lot of people. That's one of the biggest things I think in business that is the roadblock, is the owner.
Yeah, I think the first PN was essentially started with that in mind from the beginning. My career, essentially, when I first started out, the people who were just ahead of me, who I kind of looked up to, who were having an impact in terms of educating the health and fitness industry, and releasing great information products, and just sort of being, I don't know, whatever, you hate this word nowadays, but prior to Facebook, prior to Instagram, influencers, right? They were the people who influenced the up and coming waves of new professionals. And they were guys like Charles Poliquin and Paul Chek and individuals like that. And early in my career, I was fortunate enough to meet them, get to know them, and both polarizing figures, but both exceptionally awesome to me when I was young coming up. Both kind, big brotherly, just open to sharing. And I know not everyone has had the same experience with these individuals, but for me, it was beautiful experiences with them. And but the one thing that I watched was the amount of travel that they did. They're on the road 50 out of 52 weeks a year, and I'm realizing I can't do that, right? And then also noticing, and you guys maybe have had this experience with them, and even some of the new wave of leaders, is that if the individual becomes the brand, then that brand or individual has to be reinvented every few years. Because of the same thing I talked about, it's really easy to oversimplify things we're not thinking about every single day. So if Charles Poliquin is the strength guy, a couple of years later, he then has to come out as the hypertrophy guy. And then a couple of years later, he disappears for a while. Then he has to come out as the functional medicine guy. Then he disappears for a while. And then you know what I mean? And this is a natural consequence of the audience being like, well, I've learned everything there is to learn from the Charles Poliquin that I know, right? So he has to be reinvented. And it's really difficult to reinvent yourself as a brand. So for me, super early on, I was like, hey, I'll go out and do the education. But the long game here is a brand, not me. You know what I mean? I don't want to be fused, where my role and my soul and the company are all just this big tangled ball, right? And so super early on, that was the intention. It's I think why PN had such success, because I'm like, I don't want to be fused with the brand, number one, and number two, I can't travel like that. I'm way too introverted. End game was to have a family, and I'm like, I'll be away from them all the time. That doesn't make any sense to start a family and be gone 50 out of 52 weeks. So the co-founder of PN and I, Phil Caravaggio, sat down and said, okay, what if my rules aren't a limitation? Like, how can I succeed in spite of the fact that I won't travel, like that I'm introverted? Is there a way to succeed even bigger because of it? Right. So this is right when people are starting to get internet, because you have to remember, like, we started this business before there was high speed internet. Like, folks were still on dial up. Right. And that's why I was skeptical in the beginning. Phil's like, we're going to build this stuff and it's going to be online. And I'm like, dude, when I want to, we talked about T Nation earlier. That was the first big site I started writing for. And loading a simple HTML article with no pictures would take like 15 minutes back then. You would have to like call up the URL. You see the title of the article you're not sure that maybe you want to read. Like, you don't know because you haven't seen it yet. You click it. You have to wait 15 minutes for it to load. And you're praying that it's worth it because you don't know, right? So this is the environment we started in. But then high speed comes all of a sudden. And now you can do education where instead of flying to Stockholm or, somewhere in Europe to teach 100 students, I can make a video and I could teach unlimited students, and that was really sort of, my own kryptonite became my superpower, right? And that sort of then translated into what PN was, which really was the first online coaching company where we, coach people through body and health transformations in mass online. To date, PN's coached over 200,000 people. And then, then turn that into education. Because when we started, people were like, oh yeah, you need to do in person, right? Weekend seminars. That's what you do. And we're like, yeah, but I can only talk to 50 or 100 or however many people show up. Through the web. We can do this way bigger. And so that's sort of how it came to be. And again, it's sort of how, early realization that I don't want to, can't be the brand. And I can't teach and be out front like these guys are that I'm watching. So we need to create something different if we want to have success on our own terms.
And events are hard.
Yeah, agree.
And I can't imagine it was easier back then. Before, you know what I mean? Like, events are hard now with all the ease of access of contacts and Facebook and whatever. Like, back then, that would have been a nightmare.
Well, there's a woman on our team, Kate Solovieva, who's one of our head coaches at PN, and was an adventure racer, and she's a new mom now. She may be back to adventure racing soon after, maybe with a baby on her back. But anyway, she is an extrovert who loves events. And so for years, she'd be hammering me to do these meetups and events. And finally, I was like, Kate, you have to understand something. Like, ask an introvert to plan an event, and there will never be said event. It's just an impossibility, right? So if you want an event, you have to plan it, right? So anyway, yes, events are hard. Events are particularly hard for me because I have negative desire to be involved with anything surrounding them. Even events that PN has planned over the years, again, it's always kind of magical to show up and people be there and want to talk with you, and you can feel like you have a direct in-person impact. But even at PN events, I'm like, I'm just going to come for my time. You know what I mean? I'll come for my 1 hour and then I'll meet some folks and then I got to go because this literally, early in my career, I called it speaker's flu, where I would go do a weekend seminar and I would need 3 full days to recover. And my voice, like it felt like the flu. Like I would have symptoms of the flu just from being around people and talking that much.
I actually have a funny story about that ties all this in. So, talk about introverts. So, Dean and I, along with Dean Somerset and our partner John Chung, we hosted and Hannah Gray. There were 5 of us, and now it's chopped down a bit. Last year, we had a conference here in Edmonton. And so I'm far and away the most outgoing extrovert out of all 5 of us. It's not even close. And then we chose a whole bunch of guests, mostly Canadian. Lee Boyce, we got Lee Peel, Greg Knuckles, Dean himself presented down the list. And everybody was quite introverted. And so that left me, I was on the entire weekend connecting people, getting people to, engage at the mixer. I was the MC of the whole thing. Right. Anyway, and I started not feeling very well just at this after dinner on the Sunday. So I went home and I actually got hammered with the worst flu that I've had in years, just because I was so amped up. And probably like all those shaking hands and whatever and everything that came from it. But I was completely wiped out. So I can understand that completely.
Yeah.
There's a lesson
in here. Thing. Like,
yes, I think some more extroverted people.
Yeah. And I think there's an increased susceptibility to sickness, but I literally thought I would get sick every time. And then I realized I'm not actually sick. I didn't get the flu. This is the consequence of being in front of people and talking for that much. Okay. That's not worth the trade-off. You know what I mean? Like, this has to be done a different way for me. And again, like the meta principle here is, again, for coaches, aspiring entrepreneurs, business owners, whatever, like there's a set of Venn diagram with a set of spheres that if you do this right, you can find the overlap between like who they are, the people you hope to serve, who you are, the unique things you can bring to the world, right? On the terms that you want to do them on. And if you can find the perfect middle ground, that overlap there, I mean, that's what we're talking about in terms of like meaningful, rewarding, sustainable career, right? Where it's on your terms, serving the people that you want to serve, the way that you want to serve them, Now, it's not easy. It takes a lot of, first, personal development, second of all, audience understanding. But if you get there, it's a phenomenal, it's what we all, whether we have articulated it in our minds well or not, aspire towards. And that's why a lot of us who thrash around early in our careers, like, I'm going to try this. No, I hated that. I thought I might like it, but I didn't, are actually looking for, whether we say it that way or not, we're looking for this sort of perfect overlap between who I am, who they are, and the terms that I want to interact between me and them. And if we can get that, it's a beautiful place. And, most people in the world, this thinking isn't even an option to them. But if you're listening to this and you've got, a $600 to $1,200 device in your pocket that you're listening to it on, and some headphones, and you spend your free time listening to health and fitness media and podcasts and stuff, you're probably in that tiny sliver of the world that can self-actualize in that way, which is exciting.
The crazy thing is the amount of options. Like you say, like, oh, like you kind of had the forward thinking. I would say it's almost different at this point, because anyone who kind of jumps in can have access to all those things that you did, blogs, videos, online education, seminars. Like they can do that because they've seen it, they're exposed to it. And I would say it might be harder to find what you're good at, because everyone thinks that they need to do it a certain way, and they can do it. Like, to do that at the time in which you did it, you had to build a following, you had to start writing, because no one would come to these events, and like there was no one online kind of going to these videos. So it's kind of cool to see the difference. But the meta principles are probably the things that matter the most. And I bet they get skipped a lot with a lot of the new entrepreneurs coming out, because they're exposed to everything.
Yeah, specifically the mass exposure to tools, right? Like nowadays, all the tools are, they're jammed down your throat. Like back when we started, like Phil fortunately had a systems design engineering degree. So he was building websites for IBM and places like that before we met. So he taught me how to code our first website. But the very first website we did, we had to write HTML code. There was no like plug and play easy applications for this, right? So nowadays, it's the the techniques are jammed down your throat such that I think if you're young and you're just getting started, you don't know that there's meta thinking involved, right? You're just like, cool, websites are easy now. Fire that up. Great. Got a website built. Okay. Got to get an audience. All right, cool. Facebook for that, right? Oh, I can pay for ads. So these are all techniques, and just to give you an example, like whenever I talk about, let's say, marketing now, right? People's brains automatically rush right to, paid social media activity, right? And what I call marketing is tell everyone about it, right? I mean, I think there's basically three principles of business. All business can be summarized by these three things. One, know what people want and are willing to pay for, which is a whole domain of expertise you have to develop. Two, make something awesome, remarkable to deliver that. And then three, tell everyone about it with a little asterisk. It's not everyone, right? Because the Super Bowl ad is tell everyone, right? Costs $30 million. Tell everyone who wants to buy that thing. You know what I mean about it. And so whenever I talk to tell everyone about it, that's where everyone rushes into paid advertising, particularly social nowadays. But those are just techniques, right? They're tactics. I start people off like this: pretend there's no Facebook and Instagram, and how would you do the actual thing I'm saying? Tell everyone about it, right? Tell everyone about your awesome new product or service. Like, you could pick up the phone and call the people that you know. You could write a letter. You could write an email. You could flyer all the cars at the Walmart parking lot, right? How could you tell everyone about it without Facebook and Instagram? Because before these things existed, there were folks out there trying to tell everyone about it, right? So there must be ways. So we need to start with this thought exercise of meta principles. How do you reach all the people who might care about your thing? Okay, not all the ideas are going to be great. Like, maybe you don't have a lot of phone numbers, so calling everyone isn't going to get you very far. But by making a list of all the ways I could tell everyone about it, it reminds me of a set of books I read in the early 2000s called Guerrilla Marketing. And that was the whole premise. If you don't have big advertising dollars, which most people working in health and fitness don't, right? There's only a few companies who do. How can you get the word out? It's this idea of guerrilla, sort of underground, using word of mouth, using clever tactics to get in front of people in ways that aren't very costly is how people ought to be thinking. But again, nowadays, there's more opportunity than ever, but there's more competition than ever. But the sleight of hand is companies are telling you about their stuff on how to build a website and how to spend on Facebook. Like, you're the consumer being marketed to, and you're being tricked a little bit into tactics over principles.
It's actually just, it reminds me of, because you're essentially looking at the essence, and my wife and I were watching the show called Dragon's Den, but essentially they go on and they pitch ideas. It's kind of like Shark Tank for the US. But anyway, totally. The ones who've been like that have killed the presentations and got deals were, it's usually the French Canadians or the English second language learners, because they have to, like, when they pitch, they're like just getting to the point into the essence of it. And I'm like, that's brilliant, because usually, and not usually, but there's a lot of people who just kind of just go on and on and on about stuff that doesn't matter. And a lot of the French Canadians, because it's in English speaking, I'm like, that they explained it so well. And it just reminded me of that, because like, you can have all this stuff and it almost ends up being noise, and it doesn't get what you want anyways.
I think there's another thing to take from all this too. I've actually moved myself so we don't have background noise. Hopefully the echo is, I'm at Evolve right now. And all this talk about all the effort that it took, the steps people had to take to get themselves out there and their names out there without the ease of the internet. Now, looking around the industry and where all those barriers are removed, and we have this ubiquitous access, and we have a massive glut of people, while that allows a lot of people with good quality information to reach an audience, it also allows a lot of people who haven't had to go through all those barriers, who may not necessarily have the quality or the credibility to do the same thing. Do you have any thoughts about that dichotomy and how to navigate it for the end listener user?
Yeah, I mean, I don't bemoan the fact that there's bad information in the industry, right? The gateway to having people provide bad information in mass is wide enough for good information to enter also. You know what I mean? So like you said, once upon a time, almost no one could get through any gate to provide information, right? Like the gate was too small, the barrier's too high. Nowadays, the internet's provided so many amazing, wonderful things that if the one of the only trade-offs is that there's a lot of bad information too, I'm willing to deal with that trade-off and I'm not going to complain about it, right? Gosh, what innumerable benefit has all this information age brought us? I mean, it's so phenomenal. So complaining about it seems a horrible waste of energy and time. With that said, I think it's then incumbent on the people with good information to drown out the bad. You know what I mean? That's what we often said at PN. If people don't find us, who will they find? Well, I shudder to think at what they're going to find, right? So let's be loud enough. And this is how you convince your coaches that we need to spend on marketing, that we need to get good at sales. That is a particular dichotomy, right? People who are scientists and people who are coaches generally feel squeamish at conversations about resources being devoted to or trainings toward or any mention of let's say crafting a story around what we do so that it can be effective marketing and sales. But the rationale, if you're in an ethical place, is if they don't find us, look at what else they're going to find. Screw that. We're going to make sure they find us, And so that's always been a really important cornerstone of what we do. And, people who are cynical will say, oh, that company's so popular, this company's so popular because they're great at marketing, right? As if that's a pejorative kind of statement, right? And for me, it's just like, hey, great at marketing with terrible service delivery is bad. Great at marketing with erroneous information is bad. But gosh, don't you want the companies that have good information and tremendous service to be great at marketing also? Otherwise, it's the shitty ones who are getting all the attention and attracting all the people that we're here to help. So for me, it's just, this is what's incumbent upon any entrepreneur or any business. Get good at this part too, right? Not or, but also.
Would you have changed anything? Like, because now I look back and like, even now, one of the hardest parts of, I guess, being the person giving the good information, because you feel like you need to kind of block out the noise. The hardest part is hitting critical mass. And that's hard without being like super flashy and using buzzwords and all that stuff. But looking back, would you have changed anything based on the way you did it? Because obviously we're looking at, like you said, early 2000s, like, right? Like we're talking a long time. Mm-hmm. Would you have changed it? Or like, is there anything that you would have done differently marketing wise?
Yeah, probably not really. I mean, PN happened the exact way that
that's awesome.
I wanted it to happen. You know what I mean? Or that like, I could have never projected that it would have been this big. I could have never projected that it would have been as popular and successful as it was, but we didn't start it to be commercially successful, right? Like Phil and I started it because it's what we like doing. It was within our unique ability sets and it fit in with our purpose and our values. And people seem to like it, and I mean, it feels like there was an inevitability to it now. But when we wrote the first certification, literally every, personal training and strength and conditioning organization told their people not to do nutrition certifications. Like the entire industry was influencing people away from what we did, right? Because at the time it was considered out of scope of practice. Now, what gave me sort of heart and emboldened me to do it anyway was I'm close with Gray Cook, and we had traveled together and spoken together. And Gray had done what Precision Nutrition had done just a couple, 5-10 years earlier, right? So he was in the physical therapy world. He was teaching essentially physical therapy techniques to strength and conditioning coaches and personal trainers. When he started doing it, the physical therapy orgs were like, you need to stop. They sent him letters and threatened lawsuits. And this is out of scope of practice. And Gray's like, well, number one, that's dumb because we're talking about movement. And if that's out of scope of practice for personal trainers and strength coaches, I don't know what you want them to do, right? And then second of all, they want it so badly. Like we're not giving them like post-surgical patients. We're giving them people who are discharged from the rehab setting and other people who are considered otherwise healthy. So they need to be able to bridge this gap, because otherwise there's this huge space. It's like a rift between the work that they're doing in clinical rehab settings and personal training, right? So I had long conversations with him, and I felt like nutrition was the very next thing, right? Like once we handled, we'll call it like healthy movement, like both screening and then sort of that gap between, unhealthy movement and, what the three of us might do in like a performative sense in the gym, right? The next thing that comes is fuel and physiology, biochemistry, right? And then, I think the next wave, we're starting to see it like sleep and stress management, right? So, and so when we started the PN thing, that was, at least the education side for coaches, we got the same thing. So when we started getting those letters and the pushback, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what happened to Gray. This is perfect. It's like this script going, just it's just deja vu with a different subject matter. And so anyway, I won't go on and on, but
did people get mad at you? You seem like so nice and calm, but I can see like back then you getting in like almost fist fights over this stuff with like
oh yeah, I mean, I would be on the stage with a group of dietitians talking about these things, about how important it is to hand some basic lifestyle information to the coaches who are the frontline providers for health and fitness for their clients. And just like it'd be 6 people just turning all their chairs and facing me with anger and animosity. But again, what heartened me was that the audiences were never against that. They were always like, of course, this is stupid. And you have to understand, like, there's no amount of top-down pressure, unless you live in an autocratic government, that prevents the mass of consumers getting what they want. Like nothing prevents that,
I can attest to what you're saying earlier, because this is one of the things that I remember early in my career taking away from you. We kind of forget that, nutrition as part of the personal training process on the gym floor wasn't always there. I remember it was you very specifically advocating that the personal training model as it was going to need to expand into more of a, I believe the word you used was concierge sort of service that encompassed nutrition and other things like sleep and self-care. And that's one of the reasons why I remember doing PN level 1 years ago. I think I probably did it about 7 or even 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I felt that I was one of the early ones in my space here in Edmonton as a personal trainer in a commercial gym who was bringing nutrition into the conversations with the clients, because I felt that, if you wanted to set yourself apart as a trainer, you needed to be very skilled in this realm. And I think it's so easy. A lot of trainers would just say, they would just turn around and say, hey, I can't talk about nutrition because it's outside my scope. Right. And I think that's less about any fear of legal or ethical ramifications and more just they didn't know it. So it was an easy excuse to just say, hey, I don't do that.
Well, when I was at Ben's place with Eric Helms, like one of the things that stood out to me was like he called like asymmetrical risk, but like even now with sleep, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's out of scope and blah, 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 blah. It's like, what's the risk of telling someone to sleep 8 hours? Same thing with like a lot of the basic, simple diet stuff is like, are you really doing any harm? And like, what's the upside to it? So it's interesting because there is an evolution of seeing the risk reward ratio, because it's almost like the old guard, or like you said, the top down approach. They're just holding on to this thing. And the benefit of like kind of letting some of that stuff out would help more people, because it's hard to get into a dietitian. It costs money to get into a dietitian, and telling someone to eat more protein and like control your calories, are you really out of scope? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's two things, right? One is obviously financial incentives, right? If I live and work in the dietetic space, the idea that there would be this group of other professionals who are more poorly trained than me, which is functionally true. I mean, if you are a dietitian, you've done a 4-year degree in dietetics and you've done a clinical internship and you've passed a government certified sort of board examination. So a personal trainer who does even a precision nutrition kind of certification is less educated than you are in terms of amount of hours learning this material. Now, whether the material is on par in terms of quality or whatever, irrelevant. It's just your perspective will be, I'm a dietitian. I've done all this training. I'm certified by multiple bodies, by this university, by my state or provincial government. And now these people are going to take business from me, and they are less educated than me, and they are less prepared than me. I totally get why you'd want to dig in. It makes complete sense. Like, being mad at dietitians for feeling reticence to accept our ability to talk about this is silly. And then the other thing is just old ways, right? And old ways. I remember learning this in a philosophy of science class in undergrad, right? Basically, there have been a number of individuals over time who have studied the change of paradigms, like in the scientific world, right? So how do paradigms change? There's a model which talks about scientific paradigms change through like a linear progression of new studies being added in a body of research, and each new study contributes a bit more knowledge, and eventually sort of we stair step our way to paradigm change. But there's this other guy who talks, Thomas Kuhn, who talks about no, scientific paradigms change when you blow up the old one, right? They don't work in a linear positive way. You have to literally blow up an old theory and then come to light with one that better describes reality.
Often, isn't it the old generation of academics that are the status quo actually kind of die off? Is one of the major catalysts for that
That's
shift.
Right. Ben Helms was you have to die or retire. Basically, the old guard has to die or retire before the new ideas can actually take root in a field. And it's because the new guard are generally the guard, right? They're the ones who are deans of academic programs. They're the ones who are chair people at scientific conferences. It's nothing nefarious. It's just simply, when you've been in the field for 30 or 40 years, you've made many positive contributions. You're the folks who decide who's going to speak at the conferences. You're the folks who are going to become or decide who becomes faculty members at key research universities. And if these new kind of renegade thinkers are coming up with theories, especially that are starting to debunk yours, right? It's really hard to give them jobs and give them keynote speaking gigs, right?
There's like problem now where they're like not even, like, a lot of the times, like, they don't even publish null findings because like it kind of goes against the stuff, and it's almost like to the point where, like, you look at, like you said, the RDs, and they're holding on to this incentivized. It's almost to the point where there's some publications that are incentivized by like pushing an agenda, and it must be frustrating when you're trying to push into that. But I think, like, obviously you did it,
and also, like, again, I mean, you can choose frustration, or you can understand how things change. I mean, right now we're talking in the midst of a very powerful movement about human rights right now, right? And again, there's cause for frustration. There's also needs to be an understanding of how change actually happens, how long it takes. Like, if we riot for the next 1 year, will equality be achieved? The answer is no. Irrespective of whether rioting or peaceful protesting were the right things. It's just things don't change on that timeline ever. We just look to history to see that. So scientific theories don't change quickly, and social programs don't change quickly, and the distribution of funds from governments don't change quickly, and our perception of people who are different than us don't change quickly. That doesn't mean we don't do the work towards it. We just have to understand and then make the decision. And I'll depoliticize this really quickly, and say, I have a really good friend, one of the chief ass kickers I've ever known, right? She has an MD in a specialized rehab medicine. She's got a PhD in exercise movement, stuff like that. She has several Olympic medals. Like, you don't meet more accomplished people than this person, right? She's won the Olympics a bunch of times and has an MD and has a PhD. She just kicks all asses wherever she goes. And I remember having a chat with her because she's been in school forever, right, about career. And I was doing my PhD when she was doing hers, right? So I had gotten out and done stuff in the workforce, and she was still educating. And we were just talking about career. One of her great passions is sort of exercise as medicine, right? She wants to see because she's so credible, right? Like she can actually be the kind of person who walks into the medical community and say, hey, we need to look at exercise more seriously. Hey, we need to think about prescribing exercise more seriously. Hey, we need to affiliate with people who are trained in exercise more seriously. So she's the right person for the job. But the one question I had for her was, okay, so when you die or retire, right? So she's in her 40s, like I am. So let's say you live long, you continue to be vigorous, you live to 95, and you work all that time, right? So over the next 50 years, you work on this. Are you okay dying knowing that your vision still won't come to light? Because that's the reality we're facing. The medical community will never embrace exercise on the level that you want them to in the next 50 years because things don't happen that fast. Are you okay dying and knowing that your vision hasn't come to light, but that you were a key person pushing that snowball down the hill and giving it the momentum that one day it will become that thing, right? And so that to me is something I think about a lot. I talk to professionals about a lot. There's some things you can do in the course of a human life and others that you can't, right? What do you need more? Do you need to see your vision come to fruition? Or do you need, are you okay starting the ball in motion, getting no credit for it, but being part of the change that eventually will take place generations from when you got involved?
When did that come to light for you? Like, because I'm maybe I'm wrong, but like I can't see like 20-year-old John with that sort of foresight. Like how did that come about? And maybe you did. Maybe you just were like always had this vision.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I've always, again, being an introvert means you stay home a lot. And when you stay home a lot, you need stuff to do. So you read a lot of books. That's what I did anyway.
Yeah.
There wasn't like Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime and all the things. So I just read a lot of books. And so, when I was an undergrad, I did a pre-med undergrad degree, but I did minors in philosophy, psychology, African American history, sports psychology. Like I took double the classes as anyone else. I had been a terrible, terrible student in high school. I was an alcoholic and I was drunk and high most days. And then I had a break in between where some things happened and I got wake up calls. And that's the first thing that sort of brought me to the gym. And so when I went back to school for university, like I had been devoted to bodybuilding and I've learned all these lessons about discipline and drive and hard work. And I had success in bodybuilding. And so when I came back to school was easy, man. Yeah. It really was. And that's not because I was innately gifted. It was just like, gosh, I've done a bunch of things over the last couple of years that required like a pretty tremendous work ethic. School is pretty easy when you have this ethic. So I just double up on the classes and take more than everyone else. So probably by the end of university, I was asking bigger questions about my life. And I remember like there was a real pivot point because I had a pre-med degree. So the next logical thing is go do med school, right? And I remember and I don't quite know where it came from because I didn't plan on asking these kinds of questions. But I remember I applied to med schools, I got in, and then one day I asked myself, am I going to like this? Like, am I going to like med school? And I was like, no, it was just so clear to me. I was not going to like it. And then why am I going to do it? Well, because I come from an immigrant family. And when you come from an immigrant family, you become a doctor or a lawyer because that's the way to display status. And also doctors and lawyers generally do pretty well in any culture, right? And then number two, I thought it would be hard. And at that point in my life, I was challenging myself with the hardest things I could think of, right? I want to win a national bodybuilding title. Okay, cool. I want to win a national powerlifting title. Okay, cool. Go do that. All right. Now, what's the hardest academic journey you can go on? Probably pre-med to med school, right? Okay, I'm going to do that. But then I had this moment of, but I'm not going to enjoy that. Which, what if I were to want to have fun with this, what would I do instead, right? So then I gave up the med school to do an exercise science master's, which everyone thought was totally nuts. But,
back then too.
But again, that was really the first time in my life. And I think this infusion of like philosophy and psychology, and then just questioning knowing myself, like people talk a lot about mindfulness nowadays, and meditation's become a part of that conversation. But I remember being exposed to meditation through sports psychology in like 1992. So that's when I first started this sort of doing, mind body scans, doing meditation, doing mindfulness work. Before, my friends thought I was totally weird and kooky for doing this kind of thing. But that's, and I think, again, this isn't me being like everyone should meditate, but really the things that people say about meditation are real. They come true. Your ability to see through the distractions of everyday emotional roller coasters. Your ability to take an extra beat between feeling and reacting. Your ability to ask bigger questions of yourself and the world and your place in it. It can be a vehicle for that, right? So I think it was kind of reading, being exposed to great thinkers, doing the self work as well, and kind of all led to this. And then it just, then you just keep practicing it because you're like, wow, this is important. It's fun. I like being valuable to others in this way, and gosh, it helps me charter my own path well.
I had a thought, and it kind of goes back to our previous conversation. I don't know, I've never heard you describe it this way, but do you ever realize that what you did with PN was disruption of the entire dietetics industry? I mean, we talk about disrupting now in terms of Uber or Airbnb and what have you, but I think of what you did to them almost like what Napster did to the record companies. So you have this industry that's sort of like stuck in its way, and it was resentful of personal trainers creeping in, but you realize, well, hey, there's an opportunity here, and all of a sudden now, I don't even have any relationships with local registered dietitians, and it almost seems like they seem dug in to not jump into this marketing space. There are exceptions in our greater industry, but they don't seem to, and they almost seem to have a slight antagonistic relationship with personal trainers, like we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. But what that's done, unfortunately, is it's left all this space for PN to come in and dominate. And then, going earlier to, you stepping away from the brand, look at how many big companies have followed in your model. I can't believe for a second that Renaissance Periodization isn't heavily influenced by what you built. I think that Stronger You, which Dean is a part of, is definitely heavily influenced. Macros Inc. And these guys are technically your competitors, but they've all done very similar things. Mm-hmm. And no one in those organizations has actually stood out as being a brand larger than it. Mike Isertel at RP, sure, he's a big name, but he goes out of his way to really highlight the other members of his team. Mm-hmm. So have you ever thought about yourself as a disruptor? And let's take this into a question. What would you say for people who are listening to this up and coming? What kind of attitudes or how would they look at this whole situation for themselves to grow as a brand?
Yeah. So no, I mean, the disruptor thing, that wasn't really a word when we started, right? That's kind of it's a modern kind of born out of maybe Silicon Valley ethic term. And so, and I don't say that in a pejorative way. I think but it feels to me a descriptive term rather than something one aspires to. It's what you do to describe a company that's done something noteworthy, rather than what you start with trying to be. You know what I mean? And I think it might just feel like semantics, but I don't think it is. It reminds me of this idea. People will ask me like, oh, John Berardi, cool. I want to do what you do when I grow up. Like I'm a young college student or whatever. I want to do what you do. And I'm like, well, be careful with that, because I didn't want to do what I do when I was your age, right? Like and you might not even know what I do. Like you have a very, very surface level understanding of what it is that I do. So let's be careful with these kind of things. But there was a moment where the disruptor kind of idea did occur to me, and I'll describe it after. So in 2016, Phil and I started to realize that PN was getting too big for us to lead on our own, very specifically financially, right? I mean, you have two people whose whole net worth is rolled up in the organization, right? Like we're not rich guys outside of PN, right? We do okay, but that's it. And Precision Nutrition's monthly expenses are well more than our net worth. You know what I mean? So literally, if something bad were to happen, and thankfully it never did, we wouldn't be able to support the organization just paying salaries for 1 month. You know what I mean? Like, this thing is too big for us. It's grown too quickly. So we need some help. So that's when we started looking for partners. We ended up finding a private equity company who purchased the company from us. And when that happens, you you get a crash course in finance really fast. You know what I mean? I don't know what a company's worth. I never even thought of PN as a saleable asset until this whole thing happened. And I know, like, intellectually I could have, but PN was always just this. Yeah, it was just this weird thing we did. It was based on me and my weirdness and my desire to not travel. And my old thing was just, you see this chair, like this specific chair I'm sitting in. Like, I've had this chair since we started PN, and I'm like, when someone says, "Hey, John Berardi, can you participate in a thing?" My first question is, "Can I do it from this chair?" If yes, then we can continue talking. If no, I probably don't want to do it because it means I have to get on an airplane or go somewhere to do it. So this whole company is just me and my chair thing and all this stuff, right? So this is an asset someone else would want to buy? Nah. But it turns out that it is, and someone else did want to buy it and they wanted to spend a lot of money on it. And so when we started looking at the financials of comparable organizations, we realized, like, wow, PN is a bigger company than ACSM and NSCA combined, right? And these were the big influential companies when I was coming up in the academic world, right? Like, you go to the ACSM annual conference every year and you go to the NSCA conference every year. PN is bigger than all the dietetics organizations combined. And that's when it sort of dawned on me, like, holy crap, we built something bigger than every academic institution or society or whatever that I've ever been a member of. That's crazy. That was when it felt disruptive to me. But only kind of in my own mind, right? I don't want to disrupt any of those businesses. I think there's enough desire for education and there's enough money for everyone that I'm talking about to thrive. There isn't a scarcity of people wanting continuing it, especially now. The one of the market segments that thrived both during the 2007 2008 economic crash, due to loans and mortgages and that kind of thing, interest rates, and then the crash due to COVID and what's happening right now. Both of the market segments that skyrocket are education, because in times of uncertainty and job loss, people pay for shoring up their credentials, right? They pay to learn more, to maybe have more job security the next time this kind of thing happens. So I think even now there's enough money for everyone there to thrive. So disruption just feels a little bit scarcity minded to me. Whereas, I feel like, oh, all these companies can do really well. But it was the first moment in my own mind, it disrupted this particular notion of what the influential organizations could be in our space.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like, I think that was the big thing, is it's not necessarily a role model, but like, even like the whole personal trainer thing, it's like you go into it and you think it's like you're going to be a personal trainer, but like it can turn into these things because there's examples of it, which is it's hard to do unless you kind of disrupt that to say, hey, like, if you're in fitness, there is money if you like have, like, obviously if you do things right, but there is that end of that goal could happen.
Yes. Yeah. And that was my gig. Like, I graduated undergrad, I moved to Beach, Florida. I started a personal training business. That's what I did. And then I paid my way through masters and PhD training clients, so that was my background. And that's what I did all the way through. And PN's first big product was essentially, DIY way of teaching how to train yourself. And then we started a coaching program, which was a online, geographically unlimited, personal training option, right? So that's really what it was born out of, just the desire to help more people with what we knew.
It's like, I don't know. It's just like, I'm not sure how many times you've told that story. It's just kind of cool to see how it goes in, especially like as we're sitting right now, where it just feels like there's a lot of stuff coming through the pipeline, especially now with COVID and everyone's going online. And you're talking about a time when online, like you said, it was 15 minutes to get a damn article up.
Yeah.
And it kind of comes full circle to that thing where like those meta principles still matter. And like your story is essentially.
Yeah. Well, let me share something like specifically to that. Like, and again, I've had some good people kind of float across my path for, I don't know how or why, but there was a guy who he was, I think he read my articles at T Nation back in the day. He's not in the field at all, but he was just interested in, health and fitness development and strength and stuff like that. And I think we started corresponding on email, and then I think we met up a few times, and then he ended up being my neighbor. I lived in Austin, Texas for a while, and he was my neighbor. So it was myself, and then right next door to me was a guy who worked for PN at the time. His name's Carter. He's still one of my closest friends. And then on the other side is this guy Jeff. So Jeff, he's been essentially retired ever since I've known him, and I met him when he was like in his mid 30s. And so I was like, what does this guy do? Well, he doesn't do anything. Well, what did he do, right? So he had written a book called Stress Free Success, right? And the idea was how to double your income while taking an extra day off a week, right? Now, this is a tired, cliche nowadays, but he did this like before there was any of this, right? And he's like the OG internet marketer because there wasn't internet when he started doing internet marketing techniques. But what he did, and again, seeing it play out in this previous generation is so interesting because it teaches you principles, not tactics. So what he did was he, like me as an introvert, he hated going out and selling his book. So he stopped publishing it and he turned it into a course. Okay. And so then what he did was he partnered with specialty industries, and he partnered with like I don't know, a well-known figure in each of those industries. So in chiropractic, he partnered with someone who is like a chiropractor influencer. In the mortgage space, same thing. In real estate, same thing. So then they custom tailored this curriculum to all these niche industries, right? And instead of an email newsletter, because no one had email at the time, they got faxes. So think of all the newsletters you're subscribed to now, but instead of getting it in your email inbox, he would just fax marketing materials to their offices, right? And they were long form sales letters. They were really well done and compelling. Like they spoke specifically to the needs of a overworked mortgage broker, an overworked, real estate agent, an overworked chiropractor, promising them, hey, I'm going to help you make more money from your practice while actually taking some time off to be with your family or pursue your hobbies and passions. And just like mapping this over several industries, the guy absolutely crushed it. I mean, his service delivery was faxes plus a phone call with his groups, and you just think like it seems so primitive and simple, so much so that it's easy to look down on it, right? It reminds me a little bit of you ever look at the great works of, let's say, architecture or city infrastructure of like remote peoples, right? And you think like, how do those dopes do all this? You know what I mean? Like it's the first thought that modern people have in their heads. Like, how did those primitive people build the pyramids? You know what I mean? How could they have possibly done it? Or like, look at some of the sculptures, the artwork of the Roman times. There's just this feeling that like the older stuff, like the people couldn't have been as smart or advanced as us, right? And so, and I'm not saying that's true, but it occurs to a lot of people, and I think that happens. Like we get seduced by modernity, and we then get wrapped up in the techniques of modern times rather than the principles. So this guy was so influential for me because I was like, wow, okay, cool. Like, how can we do the current technology equivalent of that, right? And again, like it was also like an example of how you can do a piece of work and like quadruple, quintuple dip it. Like, how can I make money doing one piece of excellent work with slight modifications for different groups? It really would, knowing this guy was like a really like a functional business MBA kind of a thing. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because you see how, again, he lived 2 doors down from me. We hung out all the time. I saw under the hood of the business, so that I could see really what principles were at stake there.
But it's interesting that, again, that comes full circle to now where you mentioned it, but I was kind of alluding to it, is that like we're full of tools. And I like that you said principles, not tactics, but it's like, it's going to be interesting to see when the shift back to principles go, because there's only so many tools before, as an industry and like multiple industries get smarter with the tools that are coming out, because everything's a new shiny object. But at the heart of it all will still remain the principles. They're just not sexy right now. And so it'll be kind of, I just wonder when that's going to happen. And maybe it's always happening, and the few people see the light or have a neighbor
yeah,
and they can kind of sift through that.
I think it's always happening, right?
Yeah.
I think that in the beginning of your career, you just don't, you're not hanging around the people who are using the principles, and you don't have the language to converse with them. I remember Alan Cosgrove, who's a good friend, said this one time. He's like, oh man, I remember this one time I sat down with Bill Parisi. I don't know if you guys know who Bill Parisi is, but he had these very well-known speed schools, and they were doing NFL combine training, and they were training pro athletes, and they were training kids, and they had a very successful business of training centers, franchise, early version of franchise, training centers for young athletes and pro athletes. And then they did a franchise business, and then they did a lot of education. So Bill really is a legend in that space, and he's a great guy. And Alan was young, and Alan was like, I sat down with Bill young in my career, and I was asking him about like where to put the squat racks in my new gym, right? And he's like, I'm kicking myself now because I could have asked him so many more pertinent questions, like relevant to the success of my company. And my response was, yeah, but that's where you were at the time. Yeah. Like higher level principles might not have helped you, because you needed to figure out how to afford the squat rack and where to put it at the time. Right. So I often nowadays think of life in these kind of evolutionary phases. And when you're at an early phase, you're not there yet. Principle thinking is maybe not what you should be doing right now, when getting one additional client is the thing that'll keep your business afloat. You know what I mean? So I think, but knowing that you will have to do that thinking soon, knowing that you should start high level planning what strategy might look like, is really critical, because a lot of people just go through their career trying to get the next client, right?
And that's where the story matters, and like why we bring people like you on, because I guess that's our way of kind of, here's the story. It might not make sense to you right now, but like again, it's that role model, like this can happen, and it's just exposure, like you said, to the right people.
That's right. And you guys have read that is yes, you guys have read books that we read it the first time, and it was, I don't know why this is such a big deal. And then you went back to it and you're like, man, maybe I get it now. And then you went back to it and you're like, this is the most genius thing I've ever read, And the same with movies, and the same, we had this saying at PN, which was, like we knew our program was good. I mean, we have, 200,000 clients worth of data points, you know what I mean? Like, and we have data points, millions and millions of data points. We know the program is good, but sometimes it's not the client's time. And that's what we would say. Hey, I need to drop out now for whatever reason. And we're like, that's okay. If now isn't your time, that's fine, right? The porch light will always be on. The front door will always be open. When it is your time, come back and we'll give it another go, right? And I think about that with everything, with all the learning we can do in our lives. Sometimes you walk away from a thing and go, hey, it just wasn't my time for that thing. Maybe it will be later. And I think that's the mark of a critical thinker. You say, maybe it will be later. Maybe I'll have to revisit this at a later something 0.0 of me, and then it'll make more sense, and then it'll add more value.
I have a thought, because one of my favorite stories, in fact, it's probably the only story I ever remember specifically from any podcast I've ever listened to. It was you with Kevin Larrabee of the Fitcast. I told Jason Crow this thing. It's where you described a sit down with an old friend who said they had the perfect system to lose weight and get in shape. Now they're telling this to you and giving your profession. They knew what you did, and they went on to and they weren't in shape, and they went on to describe how it meant brute force exercise and brute force nutrition, but they didn't have the time, so they didn't start. And that story always stuck with me. And I paraphrase it with credit in a lot of social media stuff I write over the years. And it just means that sometimes people get really stuck in a way of doing things, but they never act on it. So I love that story, and I wanted to see if you'd take that a little further.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was actually in a job interview. We were hiring for a new role at PN many moons ago, and I sat down with this individual, and he was telling me about his secret weapon for getting in shape, right? And it was like running every day, and was- this was before keto was so dominating the landscape, but it was essentially a keto diet, and I was like, oh, okay, cool, and then it was, I'm really well known in the PN circles for asking direct questions that the answers can sometimes be uncomfortable to, but in a very non-judgmental way, right? So my response was just, "Oh, cool. Well, I don't know. Forgive me for asking, but how come you're not in great shape right now?" And he was just like, "Oh, well, we just had our second child," and he, listed kind of a litany of excuses, and all justifiable too, right? Like if you had to run an hour every day and eat no carbs when you have a new baby at home, which is your second, and you're starting a new job, you know what I mean? Like all the stressors are piling up. These aren't unfounded excuses. They're not weak excuses. These are legitimate excuses for the model that he had built, right? And so the answer was he had a best theoretical option for getting in shape, right? But he didn't have a best doable option for getting in shape, right? And so and this is so close to my heart because like fitness is easy for me now, if you want to call it that, right? Like this domain of my life is handled, right? But there's other domains of my life where I'm the him, or there's the danger of me becoming the him. You know what I mean? So how can I take domains that I'm new to, right? That I'm a beginner at, and not fall like victim to very specific, all or nothing thinking. This way is the best way of doing things thinking. How can I challenge biases, especially in spaces where I'm not a subject matter expert? He wasn't a subject matter expert. He was an expert in a totally different field. And so he did the thing that new people do, like beginners do. They try and seek out the best information providers. They find something that resonates with them. They stick their flag in the sand of that particular approach. And that's a very beginner approach, right? As you get more intermediate and advanced, you look at things with more nuance. You question your assumptions. So in fitness, it's easy for any coach to be like, why are these idiots doing that, right? Of course, that approach can't work during stressful times of your life. I'm less interested in that, right? As I am in my own life. Where am I going to do the same thing? And how can I not do the same thing? Like I'm working on a host of other non-fitness projects now that I'm not operationally involved with PN. So I'm writing some children's books, and I'm doing some residential housing development. And so as I go into these new spaces, it's really critical. And this is like what learning, I'm entering them with beginner's mind, but trying to port these lessons I've learned from coaching people to coach myself through being a beginner again.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about like going back through stuff, and you talked about movies and all this stuff, and you said you can kind of see it once you kind of know, you can see other high level people operating at that. And there's this one show, and you mentioned Disney Plus, but it was like the making of Mandalorian.
Yeah,
you see all these high level directors and like the dude that's kind of basically running the Disney show in terms of technology, and just listening to them talk. It's like basically chats about stuff. And I'm like, God damn, like this is the same stuff a lot of the high level people do. It's interesting to see them.
This is a different field, right? Yes.
Yeah,
This is it. Like as I get exposed to more successful people in different domains, it feels like we're talking about the same things, even though we worked in different subject expertise areas. You know what I mean? The way of seeing problems and solving problems, the way of challenging our assumptions, the way of avoiding implicit biases are similar. That's why, like, a close friend of mine is principal of a couple of Montessori schools, and he's a radical thinker, and he's created 3 schools, one for early age, one for middle age, and then a high school. What he's doing with the high schools is incredible. They don't go to a high school building. It's all project based, right? So they recently put on an art exhibit at the local art gallery where they took over the art gallery. They They marketed the thing. They made all the art pieces. This is a group of high school students. They sold all the tickets. So anyway, he's a close friend. And some days it feels like we're talking, I don't know if we're talking about my business or his, because we're talking about the same things and same principles. Incidentally, you brought up The Mandalorian. I watched it recently. I may just alienate a lot of listeners. But I want to hear it. Like, did you love that series? Did you think it was okay? Or
I liked it because of, and if you go through like the making of it, they're basically ripping out the essence and the foundation of what Star Wars is, and then kind of taking the essence, because they had different directors for every episode.
Yes.
And infusing that into each episode. And it was just really cool because it's kind of, I didn't want to bring it up, but it's kind of like I'm talking about the same fucking thing, because essentially it's that meta principles showcased through the artwork to build it.
I liked the making of better than I liked the series itself.
Absolutely.
Like, I liked what they tried to do.
Yeah.
But I remember The Witcher came out at the same time, and everyone was comparing the two, right?
Mm-hmm. Watching The Witcher. Yeah.
And I've seen them both now, and I've watched them both multiple times. And I'm like, gosh, there were only 2 episodes of The Mandalorian that I actually liked. And I really liked The Witcher series. Yeah. And I'm just like, I have the opposite opinion as everyone else, because everyone else seemed to love The Mandalorian and think it's some of the greatest series TV made in a while. And for me, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I'm like, there were only really 2 episodes I liked. So anyway, I was curious.
But it's funny.
I'm still trying to process my feelings, because I'm like,
I actually agree with you, because I liked it more. So this is actually, I'm not changing, but I liked it more after watching The Watching Of, because I was trying to piece together like why they did the series the way they did it.
Right.
Because it's not all good, but it's kind of all good depending on where because they're different directors. And I was like, I liked certain ones better. And I was like, okay, that's why. Where The Witcher was all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just interesting, because like you said, it's not going to reach everyone, because like the Star Wars moniker is going to just kind of, oh yeah, it's Star Wars, it's good. But yeah, it was way better for me after watching the making of.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that happened.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, with Witcher versus Mandalorian is, number one, you have this iconic Boba Fett type character, even though it's not technically Boba.
Yes.
And then you have the baby, the child, which everybody just fell in love with and was memed the hell out of. Whereas with The Witcher, you have the popularity of these video games, which are so extraordinary. Now, Henry Cavill really did nail Geralt, and Jaskier, Dandelion, the Bard was perfect. But they actually, they biffed on Triss. Yennefer was pretty good, not quite perfect. And they really didn't explain how the timeline worked early, so it lost some people. But I thought it was a wonderful show. Mm-hmm. But I think The Witcher had a tougher expectation to meet, whereas, in all honesty, I think Star Wars has shit the bed on all its major movies for quite some time. So this was actually, for a lot of people, the best Star Wars product that came out in a long time.
Yeah. And see, this is, again, where I'm going to make everyone hate me, but I really, really liked Rise of Skywalker. I'm like, gosh, everyone loved Mandalorian, hated Rise. I'm the opposite. So
I just rewatched it too when I got on Disney Plus, and I was like,
I console myself. I say I have a PhD. It means I'm smarter than everyone else, so I'm right. That's the bottom line. No, I'm just kidding, but and this seems like a total tangent from our show, but but your point is the exact one that I'm so fascinated by in life and learning and teaching and growing, is that I take lessons from these series that I watch and the making of those, and I port them back into what I do professionally. And, David Epstein writes about this in his book, Range. Some of the most innovative, did either of you get a chance to read that book yet? Not yet. So I told people last year was probably the best book I'd read in 3 years or something. I mean, he just nails a lot of really important concepts. And one of them is this idea that the most innovative people don't innovate in a vacuum. These innovations usually come from analogy, right? So you say, hey, I've had some experiences in a diverse set of domains of life, right? This is the concept of range. Like, hey, I've dabbled in this, I've dabbled in this, I've dabbled in this. And Ray Dalio talks about this in his book, Principles. Like, Ray calls it another one of those. Like, wisdom is essentially looking at the world and going, hey, that reminds me of something. Oh, this is another one of those. One of those being something I've seen before, a pattern or a trend or a whatever thing. And that's what David talks about too. Innovative people don't pull ideas out of thin air. They just go, hey, I remember when I was on vacation. I remember watching The Mandalorian. Here's how they solved that problem. This problem reminds me a lot of that one. I wonder if we could do something similar over here. So you pour seemingly unrelated things into seemingly unrelated areas of your life, whether it's in your relationships, in your parenting, in your leadership, in your business strategy, in your business tactics. And so this to me is what's really, really something I'm striving for and really, really interested in is how can I bring lessons from multiple domains to solve problems? Because ultimately that's what we're trying to do when we show up, right? We're trying to figure out how to be good problem solvers. And essentially conversations, what are they except for either a means to get closer with another person or a means to gather information so that I can make better decisions tomorrow than I did today. And that's fundamentally what conversation is. Either we're going to exchange some words so that we can feel better connected as people, or I want to gather something so that I can do better tomorrow, right? And I think that's what our businesses are. It's just 1,000 decisions that we have to make consistently, right? So I think getting a wide range of experiences from the books we read to the movies we watch and consistently asking those experiences, whether they're fiction books or whatever, what in here can I use to make better decisions and live better tomorrow are just so critical. And again, this is principle stuff, right? It doesn't tell you what words to write in your next piece of ad copy. It doesn't tell you what decision to make when your gym's shut down because of COVID. But it could, you know what I mean? How could we use things unrelated to this, which maybe I haven't had that experience in this domain, to port over here to help me, and this is it's the number one thing I think about every day. Like I decided to learn the piano this year, and I'm consistently asking, what can I use from training myself, from bodybuilding, powerlifting, coaching clients, eating well, what can I use from the gym and from my world to bring over to here to help me either hasten my progress or progress in a better way.
Well, I think that's probably like if we talk about this whole episode, but when we come around full circle, like what could we like impart on people? Because like you said, not everyone's gonna be ready. But if you kind of approach everything like that and just like collect experiences, because I think a lot of people that are successful aren't just trainers or that, like they've had past or they pull from their experiences. And if you can start to do that from the vantage point of thinking through things, or at least debriefing the things you have, as opposed to just consuming it, you may be able to again turn that into something down the road. And you don't know when that is, but it'll make sense one day.
Oh yeah, that's why I have this next to me. I have hundreds of these all around my house. These marble composition books where I just consistently am writing things in. And if people look through these, they would be like, what does this guy do for a living? Like there's all kinds of stuff that's seemingly unrelated in here. I mean, I even write about in my book, Changemaker, when I was going
great, by the way, which is amazing. I cannot recommend it enough. I did the audio. Forgive me for interrupting, but I was going to hijack this particular point. I did it on audio when it first came out, and then when Jason sent me a redo over of PN1, and I loved the way it was revamped from the first time I did it, and there was a change maker in there as well. So
cool.
I think that's everybody awesome. Really does need to read this book, especially if you're in our industry. So
thanks for that.
Put it at the top of your list. No, that's a.
Well, no one's going to read it now. You didn't like The Mandalorian.
That's right. So. Dumbass liked
ruined
Walker and didn't like Mandalorian. But there's that one part of the book where I was talking about going through a really, really dark time, and I was writing down like options to get out of a difficult situation, and one of them was kill myself. And that's even in one of these books, right? Like these books are my learning as a human, and they sometimes include work things and sometimes include piano things. And for those of you who do end up reading my book, I would devote Fridays to Thinking Fridays, and so I'd fill out a lot of these books on Thinking Fridays. But yeah, I mean, that's the point you were just making, right? Like, how are we gathering experiences to craft a more meaningful life for ourselves? Ultimately, that's what we're talking about, right? Why do a podcast? Why ask experts questions, right? Like, this is, again,
It never turned out that way. It's very similar to PN. It's like you said, if you have the end in mind of like, I'm going to make a lot of money, it will be a much different experience than like, I want to do this for the sake.
That's right. Yeah, let's just do something remarkable that meets a need for people and that it's really fun for us. I mean, again, if you're in that small sliver of the population that is privileged enough to be able to think about the meaning in your work, right? Rather than just needing dollars to pay for the basic necessities of life. Then I think, it's a huge privilege, but it actually becomes a big responsibility because now the responsibility is actually make it meaningful. You know what I mean? Like make the decisions that are required to enjoy the heck out of this. Because if I'm going to be working, doing something for the rest of my life or whatever, I'd love to know at the end, like that was meaningful. I had fun. Other people benefited. Those things don't happen by accident, though. You know what I mean? There's
the
privilege
some work. Of consciousness and like that top of the self-actualization, all that. If you have the privilege and you don't have to worry about food and money, all this stuff, I don't want to say like with great power comes great responsibility, but at some point, if you're there, you basically have the choice of like doing shit with it. Because like not everyone gets to just have free thinking moments Fridays and right. You know what I mean? Like that's not a reality.
No, that's exactly right. And that's why like there does come, at least in my mind, a bigger responsibility, right? But the payoff is tremendous, right? This idea, as for those who have the book, if you take the dust jacket off, there's like an etching on the front cover of the book, and it's when I die or retire, will this life have been meaningful, right? And that's my mantra. That's what I'm always working towards. And for the people who can't afford to ponder such questions, I want to inspire them to ask that and then design a life that they can answer affirmative to that. It was meaningful. I did enjoy it. Like it was worth having done that, and for me, there's a little bit of embedded history here, which is I grew up in an immigrant family. The values that my parents imparted on me primarily were hard work, like uncomplaining, unflinching, hard work multiple jobs, like they're Italian immigrants, they come from a really poor farming village in Italy. And so that's what I learned primarily from them. So I just knew like, okay, this is baked in now. I'm going to work hard on whatever I work on for the rest of my life. So that's not even negotiable. So I'm like, gosh, wouldn't it be awesome if what I ended up doing was meaningful and mattered, because the working hard was going to be the baseline, right? And so then that sort of became like, gosh, I don't see a lot of people around me asking that. I think they should, like I think this would really benefit us all. So it's become a really important thing for me. And that was kind of the impetus for the book.
I like the fact that you did turn around and with all your experience and all this stuff, like 200,000, points of data that you guys have from clients you work with, that you put it all into this compendium of all your coaching experience and all the things you've learned along the way. So as what I love the book. So like I said, I think people should put it near the top of their list to make a point of going and getting it.
Well, thanks for that recommendation. I really appreciate it. For me, it really isn't, I mean, we sold PN for a lot of money, so this isn't about making money selling books or whatever. I donate all the money that I make off the book. So I split it between raising awareness for the book and donating the rest. So I'm not going to get rich off of it. That's meaningless to me with respect to this. It felt like a sort of a capstone and a legacy project for me. And so that's why I did 2 painstaking years to put it together. Cause I'm like, hey, this has to be good. It has to be true. It has to say all the things that I think are true about what I've learned in my career. And that's sometimes harder than you'd think. I mean, anyone who sits down to write anything knows the challenge of writing. But sometimes when you sit down to write what it can trip out as cliches, or this is what people want to hear rather than what I think is true. And so for me, it was a painstaking editing process to be like, well, no, this isn't actually what I think. This is what I thought people would want to hear about what I think. Okay, let's scratch that and put what I really think mattered here. And so it was a much more difficult project than I expected, but I am tremendously proud of it.
Well, that's essentially what we tried, like whatever, but like, it's kind of what we tried to do with the podcast was essentially we had like, you kind of have this thing, this podcast is supposed to go this way. And I was like, fuck that. Like, I don't want to hear the same old questions. Like, we want to kind of just take you in a direction where it's manifesting in the way in which we saw the deficit of, like, if you're going to listen to someone, like, I want the story to be true. You know what I mean? Not the sales pitch, not the written thing that they did. Like, we got it, you did that, but like, what's true behind this thing? It's interesting because it's like you said, we're having the same conversation about something totally different.
That's it. That's right. Yeah, it's like I can read your PR statement anywhere. Yeah. On the podcast, I want to have a real conversation, you know, and I think basically podcasts only work in two ways. One is if you have a storytelling show, right? That would be like NPR style, right? Where you've gone out and you told stories and you've edited them together and that sort of a thing. Or you have authentic conversations. Those are the only two kind of podcasts that actually matter. You know what I mean?
You can see right through the ones that aren't in those categories. And like, that was like our biggest mission was like, we hate this one, but I can't bitch about it because if I can't kind of deliver the thing that I'm saying I don't like, then I'm the problem, or we're all the problem.
Yeah. I have a question for you guys. Have you ever done, or and if the answer is yes, then how many, like how often does it happen? Have you ever done interviews and then you're just like, we're not going to run that one, it doesn't meet the bar?
But we ran it.
One.
Yeah.
You know, actually.
And we learned so much from that. We're like,
There's two answers. One is, I think we're nearly at 150. I think there's probably 7 or 8 that I look back and go, all right, that was mediocre. And there were various reasons for it, or I think the guest may have, quite frankly, been more style over substance. But the overwhelming majority, I think, were great. We've learned a lot along the way. And then, unfortunately, there was one that we had a guest who we were really excited to get. And I'm not going to say any names, but it might be easily enough to figure out. And then that guest got Me Too'd and into a lot of trouble. And we were due to release in a few days. We're like, nope. There's no way in the world we can release this now.
So my answer is there's been a few, but like the only ones that were bad, and the ones that we didn't feel good about, there was a clear agenda behind it. And I'm like, fuck, but we still release it anyways, because it's like, you know what, at the end of the day, it is what it is. It's as long as it's true to us, it's just a matter of, at the end of it, it's like, hey, I'm just going to pull back from those people. It's a good refining filter process on like, what does this thing
It's part of the authenticity that this podcast is. We've also said this on the air before. We've only ever edited out one piece of one conversation from the guest's request, who was a fantastic guest, because she decided that, you know, this personal story that she launched into, she really didn't want to go there. So she decided retrospectively, hey, you know, I really don't want to do that discussion. Can you guys pull that out? And we said, absolutely. We took it. There's nothing else we've ever chopped or edited, I think, in any way, shape, or form. And then there was just one episode we had to bury just the timing, whatever, right? So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've always been curious about that, and it's an interesting dilemma that comes up for sure.
It feels bad. Like, you know when you like did something, I wish I didn't do that. But in hindsight, it's like, hey, that was helpful. And so we kind of started with the motto of, we're just like, I don't want to say we said fuck it, post it, but essentially like there hasn't been much editing, because to do that, the process would have been horrible. And then it would mean that we didn't like the way we did things. So I was like, we're just going to throw it out there, and it is what it is. And like, let people kind of decide what they like, because to kind of like nurture or tailor an image was exactly what we didn't want anyway. So it's all kind of like the manifestation of that is what we hated.
I feel like there's a growing up process too. I mean, you know, you mentioned, Andrew, like reading my early stuff on T Nation, you know, and I was maybe 28 or 29 at the time when I started writing for them. And, you know, I'm 46 now. So there's a growing up process that happens. You know what I mean? Hey, JB, do you regret anything that you wrote younger in your career? Oh, there's a few pieces I'd edit quite heavily now because I think differently about things with 20 years of experience. But I was young at the time, you know, and I was doing the best that I could. And I think it might have been the Google founders who said this, you know, when they first launched Google, you know, it wasn't what it is today. And they talked about intentionally limiting the size of their audience for a while, because the notion was that if the broader audience would have had the early version of Google, it would have failed, right? Because it had to get better. Like, it was good enough for the early adopter nerds. You know what I mean? deal with the bugs, you know, you know, they are going to enjoy the growing with you process, right? And then help you make something that the world will consume. You know what I mean?
I think this applies to writing, podcasting, YouTube. I know Jordan Syed has said this, and Gary Vaynerchuk certainly has. Their early YouTube stuff, they don't think is very good. A lot of people come to me about writing questions and getting started, and part of it is just getting started, getting your own website. And then they're both worried about finding people to read their work, but also worried about what will people think and will judge. Well, guess what? Get started. If no one really reads it right away, you have a great runway to practice before a lot of people are starting to see it, because you need to develop that skill. And what's the worst thing that could happen? Turns out it's pretty good. Turns out a lot of people see it early on, and well, that's a problem you wanted to have. You wanted to actually have more eyes on it.
Yeah,
I don't see any downside either way.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's an outcome where you never get any traction, which is also feedback, right? It's, hey, maybe there isn't potential in this for me. I've been cranking on for 2 years. The audience hasn't grown. It's not making a difference to anyone. Okay, cool. Let's kill this particular thing. And I just kind of ruled out a line of work that maybe isn't for me, you know? But
not everyone gets there though. That's that sunk cost thing. And like, I've been ruthless. Like, I think it's because I wasn't in this industry to start off with, but like I had to make the change out of teaching. But it's just like, if something is not working or like not fitting in, like it's gone. And it's like, it's in the best way to be ruthless, but it's also, it manifests differently than if you hold on to something for way too long. And I think a lot of people make that. I don't want to say it's a mistake. It is what it is, but yeah, the people I see who pivot, not necessarily pivot, but pivot when it's right that's a good thing.
And, and not to be too, self-promoting here, but there's a whole chapter in the book about this, this idea of how does one go about doing research on self to determine your purpose, unique abilities, and your value systems, which should inform your career choices. One way a lot of people do it, and it's worked for some, is trial and error, right? I'm going to try this thing, sounds fun, I'm going to try that. No, does it work? Didn't work? Oh, okay, edit, right? Try something new. I think there's a better approach, right? Throwing darts at a dartboard, how I feel today, it's a low probability play, right? It's not guaranteed to not work. But I'm all about like enhancing the probability of the things that I want in my life to come true, right? So, much to the chagrin of people around me, like my wife is so sick of hearing this, like, hey, hon, I think that's a fine idea. Are there any ways we can increase the probability of this working out? So ways to increase the probability, or that may decrease the probability, is probably a term that starts like inducing slight nausea in her life. You know what I mean? But that's how I think of things, right? So, when solving problems, when talking to professionals about their career, it's all about how can we enhance the probability that you're going to find the right things for yourself earlier on, right? That the path is a bit easier for you, that it's more resonant with you, that it has a higher chance of succeeding. That's what we're talking about here, rather than binary. This is going to work, that's going to work, that's not, and so that's where I spend a lot of my time.
I hope you coined it as killing two birds with one stone, because that's how I've kind of like, if I'm going to do something, I better get something else built up in it. So at least if it's trash, I got something.
I've always called that like double, triple, quadruple dipping, right? So it's like, how can one piece of work be used in 4 or 5 ways? That's always been something really core to my professional creation philosophy. You know what I mean? Like how can, or even beyond professional, like in my personal life, you know what I mean? How can doing this effort translate into 3 or 4 benefits for my life, rather than this effort for this benefit, this effort for this benefit, this effort for this benefit? I'm going to die before all the things that I want get done under that model,
You have a realization. I remember vividly, it wasn't even like a panic attack. I was like trying to like get everything into my brain when I first started the career. And it was like someone did something so well that I was like, I'm never going to be that. It was like awful, but it was also great because I was like, sweet. Like it's all the weight of the world's off my shoulders now because I can't never get there. So I was like, I'll just kind of do what I'm going to do.
I was talking about this recently. There's a speaker named Kelly McGonigal. She is one of the most watched TED Talks. And so I've gotten to be friends with her over the years. We've been on a couple boards together and we spoke at events together. And if you've seen her talk, she is an excellent, excellent TED style speaker. So I remember being at an event with her, and there was like a little green room where they had the screen so we could watch the presenters while they were presenting, while we were kind of hanging out waiting for our turn. And I remember, I think I went first that day, and then she went second or third or something like that. And I remember her walking back, and I'm like, Kelly, I just watched you present. You're brilliant. I was sitting there, realized I will never be as good of a speaker as you. Um, and then I realized I didn't care. You know what I mean? In that order, I was like, gosh, I'm never going to be as good as her. I'm kind of sad. Wait, no, I'm not sad at all. You know what I mean? Uh, and so I think that relief came that you're describing also, because it occurred to me that I'm never going to be as good of a speaker like her, but I'm actually quite a good speaker the way that I speak. You know what I mean? So it just gives you permission to be more yourself rather than a copy, like a facsimile of someone else.
I had the same quote. It was like, I don't like, it was on another podcast I did, but it was like, if you just kind of do what that person did, you're literally a shittier version of them.
Yes.
You know what I mean? When they're never going to be you. So it's like, just
I talk about this all the time. Yes. We don't need copies of what other people are doing. We need you to bring unique you to solve the problems of this field. And it's so hard to do early in your career because you're not quite sure who unique you is. And that's why, again, exercises in the book, lean on the people around you to help. Like, lean on your mentors. Like, there's questions that you send them. You send, like, for example, your unique abilities. You send these 10 questions to your mentors, to your parents, to people you've worked with, to people you've coached, and they tell you what your unique abilities are. You don't tell yourself because you're not going to get them right. And so you lean on the wisdom and experiences of others to really sort of compile this who I am, and then also there's this weird thing, especially when we're new to a career like you said you were, where you're like, okay, am I doing this right? And that's where we end up copying people, because we're like, hey, I have this unique thing that I could probably do here, but maybe everyone around here thinks it's wrong. And I don't know, have you guys ever eaten Dave's Killer Bread?
Nope.
Okay.
No, it's probably American.
Yeah, it is. It's American. So there's this bread that you find in most grocery stores in the U.S. and on the bag of the bread, there's this guy Dave, and he's got like long hair like a mullet, and he's playing the guitar, and his, like, it's the classic personal trainer pose where his biceps are pressed against the guitar, so they're popping. So he's a muscular guy with long hair rocking the guitar. That's Dave, who makes this killer bread, right? And it's higher in protein and lower in sugars and starchy carbs, and it's tasty, and again, it's ubiquitous. And I don't know Dave. Some people have told me he's from Portland and he's gotten into some trouble with the law and stuff like that. Like, he might not be an enviable character. But I'm just going to hold on to my story, which is, there's this guy Dave who likes working out, likes eating healthy, plays guitar. He's got this persona, right? And he's just like, you know what? I like guitar, I like muscles, I like protein, and I'm good at baking. I'm going to start a bread company for people like me, right? This is the weirdest combination, but old Dave combined them. It's, what's my purpose? What are my unique abilities? What are my values? What can I bring unique to the table rather than copy other people? No, there was no Fred's Killer Bread. It was just Dave's Killer Bread, right? So he made this thing. He patched together a bunch of, unrelated things, and now he's got bread all over the United States. It's on the shelves and right next to Wonder Bread. So he made it.
This is a totally random thought, but you get you thinking about like famous jacked musicians, like rockers, and there is actually a famous jacked Dave. It's Dave Weindorf from Monster Magnet, if you know the band. But there's not that many of them when you think about it. And
right.
I think the other one, the other really well-known jacked musician tried to have someone hired someone to try to kill his estranged wife. That was a guy from As I Lay Dying, and his name is Tim Lambesis. So he went to jail for a while for doing that.
Right.
Totally random stories.
Not setting a nice benchmark for muscular musicians.
No. And then there's Danzig. Danzig's the other one.
That's right. Yeah. And so, the idea though is, you see these kind of things. This is honestly, personally, this is one of the things I used to thrive on earlier in my life and career. The dissonance of having unexpected traits in the same person, right? So I used to love going to university I was like, I'm 5'9", 230, and 12% body fat, and crushing my courses, and just the teachers expecting me to be a meathead, but I was good at school, you know what I mean? And all this, and that's like the most surface level, but I love these contradictions, you know what I mean? And I think when we try and get serious, become adult, and especially try and do business, we're afraid of the contradictions in ourselves. We think we need to water down ourselves into something that is more palatable or whatever. But I
had the same thought today. It was like, we got John Berardi. I'm gonna like not wear a hat, and I was like, fuck it.
I've super never professional, done that. So,
right?
Yeah.
I put my hat on because I was like, I'm gonna stick true. I'm gonna wear my hat.
There you go. Nice. But we have 1,000 decisions like that every day. I think before we started recording, Andrew, you mentioned Luca, who's a good friend of mine also. And I remember at his event last year, which I spoke at, and I don't speak at many events, but Luca is a personal friend. He's been one of my biggest fans since the beginning. So when he asked, I was like, sure, you don't even have to pay me, dude. I really value our relationship. And I remember looking at the stage of all the people speaking. And I remember looking up there and going, man, every one of these people is unique. They do their thing in a very special and different way. And all the people in the audience, though, if we don't warn them, we'll just try and copy. You know what I mean? I'm like, there are no two people up here because they copied each other. Yeah. There's an Eric Cressy up here. There's a Mark Fisher. There's a me. There's a Craig Ballantyne. Every one of them is in their own lane, And so it's just such an important reminder. Like, if you don't want to be on that stage, copy the people on that stage. Mm-hmm. If you do want to be on that stage, you show up and bring your specialness to solve a unique problem in this field. That's how you get on the stage,
But I don't even want to say that that's the aspiration, but I think it's cool not to be on the stage, but I think everyone goes in there wanting to, and then they do it the way you're saying, which is copying. So it's actually good advice, but it's also, if you think about it, like, do you really want to do that too? Because like with that comes time, effort. Like, what if you have kids? What if you have all this stuff? It's kind of cool to not be on the stage too.
Yeah, or just get there on your own terms, really. Because what's the cost, right? Let's say you do copy someone. I think it's a lower probability play, right? Because there's already one of those, and you're going to be worse just because you're less experienced. Maybe one day you'll be better, but right now you're going to be worse because you're new and you're copying someone else. So it's a low probability success play. But even if you do achieve success, you're pretending to be someone else. Can't think of much worse than that.
I think that's a really amazing place to leave off. This is probably, I think, the longest podcast we've ever recorded.
Andrew.
I wish I could. I actually have a client in under 15. So, John, this has been an unbelievable pleasure to talk with you. And I hope everybody listening got a lot from this. And I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and this is fun because this is an entirely unique discussion. I've never heard these particular talking points from you before. So thanks for taking the time to come talk with us today.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, both of you. Thanks for the enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this didn't turn out to be one of those episodes you're like, man, I don't know. We should be that one.
We'll be pushing it hard. And so anyone listening to it, I mean, we're going to release it today. We recorded it the same day that you're hopefully listening to it. And we'll get you a graphic. I have a title and a graphic in mind, and we'll give it to Jason, and he wants to share around PN. So obviously we'll have a little bit of fun with that. It might be Witcher themed. We'll see.
Awesome. Why John Berardi hates the Mandalorian. It'll be the title. That's so bad.
We actually made Krista Scott Dixon. We made Krista Scott Dixon the child in the Mandalorian.
You did.
We made it. It was a good graphic. And Adam Pike got Fight Club.
I think she might be able to move things with her mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate it. And for everyone listening in, thank you. Thanks for spending time with us today. I know we're going near 2 hours now, but hopefully you got some value from us.
Shut up and sit down.